Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Natalie Walker, and I'm the manager of college operations and data systems at the Classic Learning Test. So whether you're joining us live this evening or viewing the recording later, we're so glad you found your way here. If you are joining us live, please utilize the chat with questions and thoughts along the way. Address everyone if you can, or at least hosts and panelists. We want to hear from you and engage with you. We also have a special, and I like to think, representative CLT student with us. She's a regular on this series, and her intellectual energy is always such a treat. So, Micaiah, we're so glad you're here. Thanks for joining. We're going to get introduced or reintroduced to Adam Smith, perhaps in a new way for many of us, not only as the father of modern economics, but also as a philosopher. And to guide us through that, we have Dr. Cole Bennett from Abilene Christian University, where he's a professor of language and literature and also the director of the Writing Center. So thank you so much for being here. This seminar series has something for a lot of people, but especially for high school students and their parents and educators. So perhaps before we start, you could give us, especially for the students, kind of your sketch of Abilene Christian as a community, and take it away from there. Thank you.
Oh, all right. Well, yes, let me tell you a bit about Abilene Christian. We have about 4,000 students in Abilene here, and we have a pretty large contingent, about 2,500 more at our ACU Online, which is out of Dallas program. So we do have a physical campus here at ACU that's been here since 1906, and Abilene is one of the few towns between Fort Worth and Midland, Odessa. And we have a very tight-knit community here, where we have university students and townspeople, and we have a military base, and really one of those quaint Texas downtowns that has an old historic theater and coffee shops and boutiques, etc. But our university here is just making a lot of headlines in U.S. News and World Report. It has for years. It's doing more so now because of our nuclear program. And we have big push in humanities, big push in STEM, and even a large and well-developed jazz music program. So we have a lot going on here at ACU. And I've been here since 2000. This is my 24th year. And I've been teaching English all that time, which kind of leads into our discussion tonight, if that's where I'm going. Is that where I'm going? Okay, I'm going to share my screen and make sure that I do that correctly. Okay. Natalie, you see that okay?
That looks great. Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I walk into a discussion about Adam Smith, let me just say that it is just my pleasure to talk about him. I've talked about him to my colleagues, to my students, to strangers on a bus, to just about anyone who will listen. This is a picture of me taken this past summer when I took a 2-week trip through Scotland. And when I was in Edinburgh, where Smith lived most of his professional life, he was born in Glasgow, but lived most of his time in Edinburgh. I went by, and this statue is right in the middle of town. And I had my picture. Of course, it's raining because it's the UK and it doesn't know how to stop raining. But I grabbed my umbrella and camera and told my friends, hey, we have to stop and get a picture. I did not know at that time I would be talking about him to you tonight, but I'm very glad to be doing so. I think the first thing I want to tell you, well, there we go. He is, of course, known as the father of modern economics, but he's also has a huge contribution to Western philosophy. And these are the dates of his life. And if I were listening to this webinar, the first thing that I would probably want to know is, why did someone who is teaching English choose to talk about the father of modern economics? That is a legitimate question, and I have an answer for you, but I want to start by giving you a few seconds to define a word. I'm going to switch to the next slide, and I want you to see a word and just think about, for 30 seconds or so, the first definition that comes to your mind, okay? And this is how I'm going to walk into this discussion. Here's the word: rhetoric. And I'm going to look at my watch and give you just a few seconds to think of your best definition for that word. Okay, the reason why I give you some time is because there are competing definitions of rhetoric. And if you put 100 people in a room, or perhaps a room of my students on the first day of English class, um, and ask them to define the word rhetoric, usually you get some semblance of the same definitions. So let me walk through those really quickly. First of all, you get oh, that's just rhetoric. You hear it in this layman's terms when people are perhaps watching too much talk TV or listening to too much talk radio, and you hear people spinning things, and you get a hand wave, and you think, ah, that's just rhetoric, and that's a common definition. The second definition is speech that persuades its hearers. Now, this is a pretty classical definition that goes all the way back to Athens, Greece, in about 350 BCE. And that guided what a lot of people think of when they think of rhetoric is someone is making a speech, whether it's in class or on social media or somewhere on media, that is persuading its hearers. The next definition is more of a when the Greeks fell to Rome and Rome took over, but kept a lot of the Greek writings and started to expound upon them, you got this definition that is Ciceronian in origin, discourse intended to inform, persuade, or delight. So it's a bit of an expansion from the very classical number two. And then you get number four. Pretty simply, rhetoric is the effective discourse on an audience, whether it is persuasive or informational or delightful or anything else, whether it invokes fear, whether it invokes delight or charm or happiness or sadness. Rhetoric is the effective discourse on an audience. And the reason that this is important is because that is what I teach. This webinar is not about me, it's about Adam Smith, but I teach English, but my subfield is called composition and rhetoric. And if we look at the books, before we do that, I want to tell you something that you probably already know, which is that most people who teach English at a university, I have 3 degrees. You won't be surprised to learn that my PhD is in English with a concentration in rhetoric and composition. All day long, I teach students how to write, how to advance their claims, how to advance claims with research. How I teach scientific and technical writing, business writing. I teach the theory of how people learn literacy, language theory, linguistics, things like that. But primarily, also called writing studies, it is a field called rhetoric and composition. So it won't surprise you that my master's degree from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock is in rhetoric and writing. That's all I studied was this field of how to teach people to advance their claims in writing with essays and different types of writing for different types of audiences. However, my undergraduate degree is actually in business. And so what I want to tell you is that when I was in graduate school studying rhetoric and writing, I took 4 classes called The History of Rhetoric. And what that does is it traces this idea of how discourse affects an audience. It traces it through time. So you start in ancient Greece and you learn how people made arguments in order to establish policy and how they taught children to use proper grammar and how they taught them to make speeches that were appropriate for the audience. But every time we got to the 1700s in this history of rhetoric in all these classes, we came to this name, Adam Smith. And I would always do this in class, like, wait a minute, that surely that is not the same guy, except it's in Scotland and it's in the 1700s. So it has to be the same guy. And I couldn't believe that the person I studied in business who wrote the phenomenal book called The Wealth of Nations, that is this thick. Surely this is not the same man who is talking about rhetoric. Well, it turns out that Adam Smith only wrote 5 books, and everyone knows The Wealth of Nations. If you ask any person on the street, hey, do you know a book that Adam Smith wrote? Yeah, he's the economics guy who wrote The Wealth of Nations. Yes, but he also wrote a book before that called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, also on your screen. And even before that, he had a book that was published of his lectures, Adam Smith Lectures in Rhetoric and Belles Lettres, which just means and literature. Okay. So the reason here I am discovering that this man who is the father of modern economics also spent his professional life as a teacher of rhetoric to college students in Scotland. So my walking into the brilliance of Adam Smith was kind of two at the same time, one through understanding his economic theory and one through understanding his rhetoric theory. And I want to tell you that he not only taught rhetoric to college students for college credit, but when he was finished, he would go into town to like a coffee shop, essentially a Starbucks of our day, and he would teach townspeople who did not want college credit. He would teach them how to speak more fluently and more eloquently just because the people wanted to be better speakers, like preachers and attorneys and citizens who just wanted to better their speech. Adam Smith would leave the university and go teach townspeople. Now he charged fees for that, but they didn't get college credit, so it wasn't like exorbitant amounts of money. He was just sort of a man of the people. So as we look at some of his biographical highlights, note the brilliance of the man. He was born in 1723, but he attended University of Glasgow at age 14. And 3 years later, went all the way down to Oxford and studied at Balliol College at age 17. By the time he was 25, he was, as I said, a rhetoric and literature teacher at age 25 at Edinburgh University, where he was for a few years until he moved back to Glasgow, where he was born, and taught pretty much the rest of his professional life there at Glasgow, professor of logic. So when you study linguistics and logic and rhetoric, those things are how to advance claims, how to make arguments, and how to do it well. He was a very shy, quiet person. I try to think of friends of mine who are known this way. They don't say much. They're not big and loud at parties, but everyone seems to like them. And this is the type of man that his biographers say he was. Everyone liked him. Great guy. Didn't say much. He never married. He lived with his mom for a long time. And he just taught students and wrote books. And he did not write the books we're going to talk about tonight until very late in life. And so he was just observing. It's important to note right off the bat that this book, these 2 books I'm going to talk the most about, The Wealth of Nations and The Theory of Moral Sentiments, when he was talking about how nations develop wealth and how people develop moral sentiments, these were not how-to books. These were not preachy books like this is the way people should act. This is how people do act. And I am observing this and I'm writing it down. So in the days before social science research was a thing, he was conducting social science research. And his books attest to that. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk through 5 very important quotes. I had to think, how do I talk about Adam Smith and within an hour or 45 minutes, because there's so much to talk about. But I decided to kind of land on 4 or 5 quotes. Surely I would know how many, yes. And to talk about how they are significant even in 2024. Okay. And let me go back really quickly and say a lot of people, there is something that was known in the 2000 in the ninth well the 20th century called the Adam Smith problem. And the Adam Smith problem went like this: the theory of moral sentiments talks about how people interact and are how they live in harmony together. And The Wealth of Nations is a book about competition and getting ahead and earning money. And so how can these be written by the same man? And later scholars, contemporary scholars, have said that's the reason that there's a problem is because they should be read together. They are two sides of the same coin. So the main argument I want to make tonight is that we should see Adam Smith's 2 largest works as, and frankly, the third book about rhetoric and literature, as all one piece of work, which is how contemporary scholars see him. So the 5 quotes I'm going to share with you tonight, I'm going to tie them together at the end, explaining how they're all from the same man, and it makes sense. So probably the second most often quoted quote from Adam Smith is the one I want to start with tonight. He says in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, man desires naturally not only to be loved, but to be lovely, or to be that thing which is the natural and proper object of love. He naturally dreads not only to be hated, but to be hateful, or to be that thing which is the natural and proper object of hatred. Let's think about that for a moment. When I come to school and come to work and have students and colleagues, I don't just want them to say, man, that guy is great. He's a great teacher. He's a great administrator. He's a great writing center director. He's a great writer. He's a great guy. That's what I want them to say. But there's also, I want to be a person who has earned that praise. Not just praised, but praiseworthy. I don't want them to have arrived at the conclusions that I'm a great guy off of things I've lied about, or facades that I am maintaining, or somehow I've ascribed my name to someone else's work. I want to actually be the great guy that they're talking about. And if you think about that, that really is it's a motivation, a statement about motivation that has stood the test of time. Many people that you and I know do great things that no one ever knows about for decades, and we find out maybe after they have died all the great things they have done. And we think, wow, what a great person they were. They were upstanding citizens, and I knew I liked them, and I said good things about them, but I'm so glad to know that they really were praiseworthy. And on the other hand, if someone is being praised and suddenly it's revealed that their whole life has been a house of cards, then the praise no longer lifts them up. I had a great discussion in a literature class yesterday about the play Death of a Salesman. I don't know if you've ever read or seen Death of a Salesman. There's several great movie versions of the play, but it's from the 1930s. And Willie Loman is a salesperson, and he keeps telling his wife and kids, the greatest thing in the world is to not just be liked, but to be well liked. But during the play, you see that Willie Loman does not live a life that deserves him to receive the accolades. He has a life that deserves scorn. So he's trying to live to be loved, but not lovely. And it's what helps cause his demise. It was a great discussion. I got to talk about Adam Smith just yesterday in a literature class. So I was happy about that. But this is a motivation that continues to exist in all facets of your life, not just to be loved, but lovely, not just to be praised, but praiseworthy. The second quote is from The Wealth of Nations. This is probably the most often quoted quote from Adam Smith. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and we never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Okay, now this was written at a time when there was a lot of market activity happening in the mid 1700s in Scotland. So the brilliance of this quote is that if I want something from the bakery, I don't walk in there and say, I am a poor person and I am begging you to give me a loaf of bread. Instead, I think, I know the baker. His name is John. And what John has a son who's in school, and his son is struggling with writing. So I know that I can say to John, "Hey, I'll come over to your house and tutor your son for an hour if you'll give me a loaf of bread, because that's what I know John needs." And so I am a smart person for figuring out what John needs, and John is smart for knowing I need bread. And because we're paying attention to each other's needs, we have success in the marketplace. Now, that really stretches into 2024 pretty easily, because we can't turn around in a store without seeing 100 things that people have carefully in offices all across America figured out that we need. Now, sometimes we just want them. We don't need them, but we just want them. But somewhere in New York City, or in Great Falls, or in Miami, or in who knows where, there are people saying, Cole Bennett in Abilene, Texas needs this. And so, because we know him, we know his prototype, we know a person who teaches English probably wants this kind of pen or watch or booklet or whatever, and we're going to make it and we're going to sell it to him because they're thinking of what I need. And that is a pretty strong statement of how markets operate. So before we get too far from the first quote about people desire to be praised and praiseworthy, don't think about the economic market for just 10 seconds, and think about when you leave your house in the morning and you're driving to work or walking to work. Let's say you're walking to work and you pass someone on the sidewalk and you say, "Hey, good morning." And they probably look at you, unless they're really grumpy, and they'll say, "Oh, hey, good morning." And that's because we live in a society that is built, Adam Smith says, on sympathies. Now, he doesn't mean sympathy in the narrow way, he means it in the broad way. We understand how humanity works, and when we're walking down the sidewalk, we know that it is a good thing to say, "Hey, good morning." "Oh, hey, good morning." And maybe I'm walking by and I see someone carrying a big load of stuff to their car and they drop something. And I step over there and pick it up for them. That's not because I want a dollar. It's because I'm a human being. And we live in this market of sentiments, which is the name of his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. We live in a way where we want to exchange markets. We want to exchange sentiments that are built on sympathies of how we understand humans to be. So when we get to quote 2, the butcher is not saying, "I want to take unfair advantage of that man." He's saying that man needs a loaf of bread, or the baker says that. And the butcher says that man needs a slice of meat for his dinner. And I say, "Here's what I have to offer. I can teach your kids English," and everyone exchanges and everyone gets what they need. All right. But it's not because we're begging for it. It's because we understand needs of other people. Yeah, that's very important to his to his theory of exchange. And also, I would say too, um, regarding the first quote of praise and praiseworthy, if you go to a store to buy something and you buy it and take it home and you realize that it has been falsely advertised of what it is, well, you develop a certain feeling toward that vendor or toward that store. They are no longer praiseworthy in your eyes because they lied to you or they falsely advertised. So you have a negative feeling. And though they keep selling things, you're not going to be their customer anymore. You're going to look around for another vendor. And you might tell your neighbors, hey, I went to that store and they sold me something and it was not what they advertised and it fell apart. And I tried to get my money back and they wouldn't hear of it. So that store is not paying attention to the praise and praiseworthiness of the exchange. They are soon going to go out of business. And if we had all the time in the world, we could list companies that we know of who have done that. They have tried to effect a short-term gain while ignoring the long-term sentiment of the market. On the other hand, you've also probably been a person who has had a negative experience in a store or in an airport or on a transit or something, and the way that they made it right with you, the way that they gave you your money back plus more, they lost money on that one exchange. Like it cost them more and you got a ride anyway, or you got the product and they said, hey, just keep the product. Here's your money back. Here's a coupon for something more. We're sorry. And you're thinking, wow, they really treated me well, even though I had a bad product. That's because they're paying attention to this element of wanting to be praised and praiseworthy to continue their business. So a business that does not pay attention to both long and short-term gains are failing in the market of sentiment. Yeah? Okay. Let's look at the third quote. This is from book 1 of The Wealth of Nations. It's right off the bat. This is what Adam Smith contributed. And he was the first one to contribute it in the West. So it's very important. When the whole force of the mind is directed to one particular object, as in consequence of the division of labor, it must be, the mind is more likely to discover the easiest methods of attaining that object than when its attention is dissipated among a great variety of things. Okay, now in his book, he talks about a pen factory, P-I-N. And that's, we don't really use pens that much anymore. But if you think about a P-E-N, a pen. In fact, since I'm at ACU, I'm going to get a purple one because that's our colors. Okay. If you put someone in a room and they were making pens, the whole pen, how many could they make in a day versus someone who's only making the tip of the pen? They could make hundreds and hundreds a day. And the whole idea of having assembly lines and division of labor was Adam Smith's invention or his thought. And he said, a country who embraces division of labor, they'll have people who their whole mind is thinking, I'm making this one thing, I'm making this, and I'm putting it over here, and it's got to fit this. And because they're focused on it, they can realize the economies of scale. They can, the fastest way to do it, the best way to do it, the way that is the most pleasing to the end user. They can really concentrate on those things. And I'm happy to tell you, too, that Adam Smith also says, hey, this is going to get boring to the worker. Because if he's not using his mind, he's going to become very bored. And he even uses the word stupid, which in 1700s, it wasn't as pejorative. But he said, you can't have a worker just doing one thing forever and ever and ever. So you have to make sure he's educated in other ways so that he doesn't lose his mental perspicuity. And so he was forward thinking in that. But when you study the Industrial Revolution and study the Ford Motor Company and how everyone did a certain thing and the Fords were just pouring off the line, that's because Henry Ford paid attention to Adam Smith and the assembly line. For all of its goods and bads, the assembly line was a product of that. Quote 4. This is also one of the most commonly quoted things from Adam Smith. By directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. The metaphor of the invisible hand appears once in The Wealth of Nations and once in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And people often confuse the invisible hand metaphor. All it means is that when people are seeking their own self interests, trying to better their lives, better their individual lives, then the way that products get spread across a market is as if it were directed by an invisible hand. So Adam Smith has very strong negative feelings towards what he calls the man of system. And the man of system is someone who sits up top in the government and says, put this here, put people here to work this. We want this industry here. We're going to arrange everything from the top. Adam Smith was very against that. He said when people are not concerned with directing others, but they're directing themselves, then an amazing type of distribution happens to products and they go where they're supposed to go. Now, the best way for me to give you an example of this is to talk about what some people refer to as price gouging. But let me explain. In 1996, Hurricane Fran hit North Carolina. Boom. And it really wiped out it really caused a lot of damage. And in the town of Raleigh, the power went out. Okay. This is a story told by an economist, Mike Munger, discussed with Russ Ross as they're talking about price gouging. And Mike Munger lived in North Carolina. And he said, what happened was all these people walked out of their house and power was out for miles. Well, what happens when the power goes out? Several things. But whenever it's going to be out for several days, think about the food in your refrigerator. Think about things in your freezer. But also think about people who have like infant formula, or they have insulin or other types of medicine. When the power goes out and your cold goes away, there are some people who are merely inconvenienced, and there are some people who are put in very dire situation. So there was two guys in a town that was an hour and 15 minutes away who realized what was happening, and they went and rented a huge truck that was refrigerated, and they put 1,000 bags of ice in that truck and drove all the way to Raleigh, and they came to neighborhoods and stopped and opened the door and they sold bags of ice. Now, how much is a bag of ice if you go to the supermarket? 2.50, maybe $3. They sold the bags of ice for $12 a bag. So think about that for a minute. That sounds, wow, that's terrible. Well, first of all, they had to rent the truck and they had to drive all that way. And there were people who came out of their houses and they lined up. So if you go to that truck and they say, I need ice to keep my beer cold. I have beer, it's getting warm. Well, it's $12 a bag. I'm not going to pay $12 a bag for ice if all I need is my beer to be cold. However, the people who had infant formula and insulin and medicine, they were thrilled, and they probably would have paid a lot more. And the people who had giant freezers full of meat that were, if they went bad, was going to be hundreds and hundreds of dollars, they were also happy to pay $12 a bag. But while these guys were selling the bags for $12, and some people were saying yes and some people were saying no, the police came and shut them down and arrested them because they were price gouging. So, price gouging is an interesting thing to talk about, but let's just say for a minute that the police hadn't come and they had sold all that ice. Knowing that some people would have said, no, that's really more than I want to pay for what I need it for, allows the ice to be there for the people who do need it, who need the medicine and the baby formula and whatever else they need. And it also, it sends a signal to people an hour away who did not get hit by the hurricane saying, hey, they're making 12 bucks a bag on ice. Let's get us a truck and let's go to and all these people. So the ice comes into North Carolina to Raleigh because people are able to sell it at a premium, and eventually the price then goes down, you see. So I said all that to say Adam Smith, looking at that situation, would say it is as if an invisible hand took the ice and put it where it needed to be when you let individual people make decisions for their individual selves for their own best interests. So you think of political parties like Republican, Democrats, socialists, communists, whatever. When you hear the word libertarian, libertarian often means we want the smallest government and we want people to make the decisions for themselves. That is very Adam Smithian in nature. Okay? Okay. I'm watching the time too. And along here, I'll also say there is a difference, Adam Smith would agree, between seeking your self interest and greed. This is a big deal to people who talk about Smith. A, a person who pursues a job that she wants and negotiates the salary with her employer and gets up every day and goes to work and does what she wants and leaves work and pursues hobbies that she wants, that person is pursuing her self-interest. And my colleague, let's say she's my colleague. Well, I'm working and I'm saving money because I want, a fishing boat to go fishing one day. She's working because she's saving money because she's got kids that want to go to school and want to do. We each have our own self-interest, and there's not someone from the top directing it saying do this and do that. Adam Smith says pursuing your self-interest is what helps the economy stay, it helps the distribution. But greed is a matter of the heart where you're saying, I want far more than I need and far more. So I want people to, for me to have this and for them to have none so that they will suffer. That is a moral judgment, which is different from I'm pursuing what I want to do with my life. So those are two very different things in a very short amount of time. And finally, the last quote. Commerce, which is Adam Smith's word for market activity or capitalism, commerce and luxury entirely altered the state of affairs of the West, he means. They gave the lowest an opportunity of raising themselves to an equality with the nobles, and the nobles an easy way of reducing themselves to the state of the meanest citizen, meaning the poorest. In this state, foreign wars was not the only way, was not the way most likely to give wealth to the people. So, as opposed to, here's how we get wealth, we go to war with people and take it. Contra to that, Adam Smith said, actually, when people enter into market activity, that fends off the war because people who are astute and say, I know how to fill a gap in the marketplace. I can see what people need in my neighborhood. I can see what people need in those neighborhoods over there. I know how to fill that need. That's what entrepreneurism is. I see a gap in the market. I'm going to fill it and I'll make money doing it. And then I can pursue my self-interest. That, Adam Smith said, keeps wars at bay so that people don't just start taking other people's stuff when in fact they're focused on meeting each other's needs. It was such an idea ahead of its time. And again, let me just say, it's not based on merely on economics. It's based on people in a market of sentiments who are trying to understand their fellow human beings and how to be loved and lovely while taking care of a need in the marketplace. If you've ever talked to entrepreneurs who said, "Yeah, I was living my life in this city in this town, and I kept seeing that people needed something," needed X and X wasn't available, so I invented it. And I went to a factory and I made a bunch of them. If you watch Shark Tank, this is what Shark Tank people talk about all the time. I saw this was a need and I filled it. Um, and that is people trying to pay attention to needs in the market to gain praise and praiseworthiness as well as economic ends. So this is a diagram that I'll explain kind of quickly that represents what Adam Smith said the price signal does. So if you, can you see my arrow right there? Okay. People live right here in the middle, and in the first ring around the self, you have people who are very, very, very close to you. Your family, your spouse, your brothers, sisters. Okay. These people you trust. And when it comes to exchanging things you need, when your brother comes to you and says, hey, I need some gum, you don't say, that'll be 25 cents, please. You're like, yeah, here's some gum. Okay. And when I need something, you're my family. We trade back and forth. You know, it's fine. But as you get into farther rings away from yourself, you're dealing with people that you do not know and you cannot build trust with because they're not in your world. And Adam Smith very importantly said, what governs the your interaction with people way, way away from you that you don't know are prices. So you don't have to ask yourself, Natalie lives over there in New Mexico, and I really want something that she has, so I'll have to decide whether I trust her. All you do is say, hey, Natalie, how much money? How much money do you want for that? I have the money. I'm going to buy it. I have to decide whether I want to buy from someone I don't know well. But price is what signals here. Okay, when he talks about rhetoric, which is my field, a similar thing happens. People very, very close to me, I don't have to monitor my language very much. I don't mean appropriate language versus inappropriate. I mean, people know me, they know what I mean, and they know my colloquialisms here in Texas. I can say yeehaw and I reckon and everything. But when I talk to people who are very far distant from me, I tend to be very conservative and use terms and words that I know um, we probably definitely share in our vocabularies. And I tend to be formal when I speak. So when I teach my students, when you write an academic essay, I'm not asking you to use academic language just because we do. I'm saying there will be people reading your essay who don't know you, and it needs to be academically toned and use academic ease. So I guess what I'm saying is I have seen a parallel in the price signal that Smith talks about in the market, the way he talks about language and trying to have an effect with your discourse on an audience you don't know very well. The farther they are from you, the more conservative your language has to be. And that's something that's very interesting, a parallel between language markets and economic markets. Okay, this is my last slide. So here are some key takes away from what I'm saying tonight. Number one, everything is a market and it's always at work. All right. That may make people sad, but Adam Smith would say no. Even when we're talking, even when we're sharing a cup of coffee, anytime we're talking about literature, we are having a market of our hearts. And so it's always at work. It's not something you can turn off and turn on. It's always there. I have another great example that I like to talk about that I think is pretty funny. Um, there are some states that have said, one is in California, and I know of one in Honolulu as well. They said, hey, we're seeing too many plastic bags. They're in our water. People go to Walmart and they buy things and put them in these plastic bags. And they take them home, and we want to be done with that. So the city banned what they called single-use plastic bags. So people would go, I guess, and they would try to get paper bags, but paper bags weren't always plentiful. And what happened was Walmart realized pretty quickly people like plastic bags. The market is that people like plastic bags. So what they did was they took that bag that they were using and they made it slightly thicker so that it no longer was defined as a single-use plastic bag. It is now a double use. People could reuse it. And all their stores were outfitted with plastic bags again. They were just slightly thicker. And I say that to say, not to say, ha ha, government, we outsmarted you, but to say people want what they want, and there will be someone there to figure out how to give them what they want. And when they outlawed single-use plastic bags, it didn't work. Same thing happened in California. But but also the way you deal with people is a market, and it's also always at work. And you are at all times, you are either helping people think of you as being praiseworthy or not praiseworthy. And that's happening at all times. Number two, millions of individuals making decisions for their own pursuit of self-interest will guide an economy far more efficiently than what Adam Smith calls the man of system. So if you've ever studied in the 1920s and 30s, a man named John Maynard Keynes wrote a theory of economics, which basically said the government can try to adjust an economy whenever it's not doing well to minimize loss. And it's really the person who listened to him the most was FDR, who created all the programs during after the Depression and after World War II that did not work very well, according to many scholars, because you can't run an economy from the top. It's all from the bottom, which is what Adam Smith was saying. Number three, language reflects a market of sentiments. We strive to understand the propriety of a situation, what we call audience awareness, guided by the impartial spectator to apply rhetoric in a way to be loved and lovely. Okay, really quickly, Adam Smith said, besides you and the person you're talking to, judging whether you're being appropriate and gaining praise or not gaining praise, a man has in his breast a being called the impartial spectator, who is effectively a person watching the interaction going, oh, that's not very good, or wow, that's very appropriate, or what, making judgments about the interaction. And the impartial spectator is in the mind and the heart of a person. So if you ever do something when you're completely alone that would not garner praise, that impartial spectator is watching going, that's not very good. That's not very good. So that was his invention. Okay, finally, I got to visit his grave too, which is a long way from his statue. And of course, it's in the rain. But Edinburgh has many, many markers to the brilliance of Adam Smith. And if you ever get to go to Edinburgh, they have a lot about him that you can read and see. But thank you very much. That is the end of my formal time. And I would love to hear any questions if you have them.
All right, so I'll start off with one question, and I guess it's making it a little bit more philosophical. But
Love it.
with his concept of like the free market, I guess, how the person, they know what they need to do to get what they want, whether that be praise or lunch meat. Um, and they do what is necessary, and that the effects just turn out well. Um, how would that be applied to, I guess, objective virtue, where it's not so much, oh, I need to do this to gain this for the other from the other person, but I need to do this because it is right, and the effects will turn out right. Like appeasing almost something more abstract than the person in front of you, getting that praiseworthiness or love worthiness from an objective standard of virtue.
Well, let me say first that what you said at the beginning, a person who knows what he wants, knows he needs lunch meat, or knows he needs, also very important to the equation is that the person who provides those things is focused on me. It's not just me knowing what I want. I'm also wanting to know what he wants and what you want.
Mhm.
Because we're trying to fill the needs both of market and sentiment to the other person. And so I think what you're asking, let me see if I can pull this off, if I understand your question correctly. There are plenty of people in the world who are very interested in being virtuous because that's part of their self-interest. I want to be charitable. I want to earn a lot of money in the marketplace so that I can give money away. I want to earn a lot of money so I can provide services to people who don't have the services they need, because that is a virtue that's important to me, is to be charitable. And so I do think by providing what you need in the marketplace for a price or for what I need, I can then amass it to be charitable for my own reasons. And that falls under the me pursuing what I want to do with my life.
And in that case, would that mean that this objective standard is a participant in the marketplace? Because you are seeing what it is asking for, and you, for your own self interest, are giving that to the standard for your own well being.
I don't know if Adam Smith would say there is an objective abstract standard. I think he would say it's built, like every culture and every society has what they feel are praise and praiseworthy things, and things that are worthy of derision. It's founded from the bottom up, and commenters have said, the Smithian idea is when you're a little kid and you have your parents and your betters saying, "Hey, that's rude. Hey, don't do that." Or, "Hey, what a nice thing you did." They're building in you that sense of what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, but it varies per society. I don't know if he would say there's an objective standard.
So he would say that that's irrelevant because really what you're doing is you're getting your affirmation from society in some way.
He would say that's relevant. Yes, he would say an objective standard is not relevant, I believe. I don't think, by the way, I don't think he would perhaps inject religion into it. He was not, from what we can tell, a particularly religious person. So, I mean, there's no sense of, well, we need to follow God. I mean, that wouldn't be there, I don't believe.
I have a related question about the first quote. So kind of being versus being perceived, praise versus praiseworthiness. Could we, I'd like to hear you kind of interpret that quote again, but maybe in terms of self-interest, like what is the ultimate motivation or like self-interest for Adam Smith in really being praiseworthy and not only getting kind of the results from it.
Well, I think that he is appealing to something that we would later call natural law. I think he's saying, from a person who is a humanist philosopher. He was very, very good friends with David Hume. That might be significant for those who are David Hume scholars. But he, I think he would say it is endemic in our DNA that we are people who want two things: for people to praise us and to be upright people who deserve that praise. I think that he accepts that as a given, not as someone who decides to do it or doesn't decide to do it. So it's not something that you choose to pursue, it's there with you. So when you are having a conversation with someone, or whether you are conducting some kind of business, you always have those two things at some level of consciousness guiding you toward your motivating you toward your actions, and including things that you say to people.
There, how would that relate to, it does seem like there are examples of people in the world in history who have not exactly desired to be respectable, lovable. They have desired to deserve their notoriety. So would that just be a twisted version of the same society? They're asking for a different sort of affirmation?
Yeah, I don't think Smith actually addresses what we would call psychopaths, or people who seem to, well, honestly, psychology was not a philosophy back then, but I think I have actually thought about that question quite a bit. I mean, you and I probably could name some people that we maybe that we know, or famous people who don't seem to really want people to praise them or to act in ways that garner praise. And that's kind of a mystery. And if Adam Smith were here, he'd probably say, "Oh, those people are so, there must be something wrong with them. That's not most people." But I have thought about that. I do think there are some people who want to act nefariously because to them, people saying, "Wow, what a bad person," is praise to them. And I think that they would deserve some psychological attention. But I don't think Adam Smith never thought about that. I just think it was out of his purview. It's a great question, though.
Oh, we have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll ask them one at a time. The first one is whether the objective spectator correlates to the soul as such, or some kind of soul.
Yes, the impartial spectator has been written about quite a bit, and it's not supposed to be the same thing as your soul. It's supposed to be what I would call your conscience. And I think we would all agree that however our conscience developed, if we're healthy, if we're mentally healthy, it developed from the ground up and from the outside in. The only reason I know it's rude to put my elbows on the table is because my mom constantly told me as a child, when you're eating, don't put your elbows on the table. Don't chew with your mouth open. Don't, it's rude. This is rude. This is wonderful. This is bad. This is good. And so it's more of a social awareness and conscience. Don't cheat people, don't lie to people, because that's not praiseworthy. That we drink those up, and it becomes in our breast, as he called it, a man of the breast who is kind of watching, and we regard him as someone who watches us objectively, impartially, and says, that's not right, or that's wonderful.
And then the second question, from the same attendee, is Adam Smith essentially saying what's deontologically correct ends up being the same as what's good from a utilitarian point of view in the long term?
Ooh, what a great question. Oh, that's a great question. What is, what? I think that is accurate. What is good in idea and what is good in impulse leads to effectively and eventually what is utilitarian for the society. Now, I will also point out, I mean, honestly, this particular edition of Wealth of Nations is 690 pages. So there's a lot we didn't talk about. But he does warn against, even in the 1700s, he was saying, it's so easy for humans to get caught up in the bits and baubles of things that we find shiny and fun and want to take all of our attention that are wasteful. So I think he would say our deontological sense will bring us to utility, and it will take us beyond, if we're not careful, into a life of fascinating, shiny objects that take our attention away from what's important, which are not utilitarian but are wasteful. So he even, from a non-religious standpoint, said, don't be carried away by your iPhones. I think he would be very shaking his head the way we look at screens.
So without this religious foundation for his thought, when he's saying, okay, so it's good to act in self-interest because it benefits everyone, and we have this spectator within us that is sort of socially conditioned, I guess, to tell us what is respectable, what is praiseworthy. Why would he say any sort of, I guess, thing that it's telling you to do would be better than another? For example, would the only reason why it's better to have an internal spectator that's wanting you to do honorable things rather than shameful things is because it's better for society as a whole for that? Or would it be just as valid to cultivate cruelty and horrible things in like the hearts of your children.
Yeah, yes to all you're saying. He was, as a humanist, he was very interested in the individual human and the society as a whole. And I would kind of, as you were talking, I was thinking of a great example. You have been perhaps at a retail outlet, a fast food place, and you've been really somehow the interaction with the person has gone really wrong. And sometimes part of you wants to just yell or to not to cause a scene, but just to really express how upset you are at how things are going. But there's people around, and your impartial spectator's like, hey, that's probably not a good idea. Not because it'll put you in physical harm, not because you won't get your food, but because it's not the right thing to do. Because other people standing around would see it and judge it to be wrong. So it's not merely a conscience, it's also a comment on how the community would view you if you were that person. So it is from a sense of humanism and community versus religion that this impartial spectator guides you toward the good of the community. These are great questions.
These are so good. I hate to put an end to them, but I think we're all really energized about Adam Smith, and we should all read.
It's good if you don't have to, it's good to read excerpts of this, but the book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a lot of attention is being paid for it right now, paid to it right now, and it's really a great read.
Yeah. Well, that's a great recommendation. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Bennett. This is
Absolutely.
fantastic. And thank you, Micaiah, for joining us.
Thank
And
you
everyone.
for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Bennett.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great evening.